Unlocking the Bible by David Pawson. 1 and 2 Chronicles. Introduction. When people try to read through the whole Bible, they tend to get stuck either in Leviticus or in Chronicles. Leviticus is difficult to read because there is no storyline, and the religious rituals described seem to have no connection with modern life. Chronicles is difficult because the first 9 chapters are nothing more than genealogies, with names that are mostly unpronounceable. Furthermore, having just completed the books of Kings, people are puzzled to find that so many of the same stories are repeated in Chronicles, and so they decide it's not worth reading it. So we must begin our study of Chronicles by asking why these 2 books seem to cover the same ground as 1 and 2 Kings. Our first clue to the answer is found by noting the different order of the books in the Hebrew Bible, which is quite different from the order of books in the English Bible. The position of Chronicles within the Jewish canon suggests, as we shall see, that its connection with Kings is not as great as we may think, even though it covers broadly the same period of time. The chart on page 15 will make the situation clear. Firstly, we note that the books are grouped differently. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 3 groups of books: the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings. Indeed, when Jesus spoke with the 2 men on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection, Luke records that he took them through the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings, and explained how they related to him. This was after all his Bible. See Luke chapter 24, verse 37 and verse 44. So in the Hebrew Bible, the first 5 books are the Law, also known as the Torah or the Pentateuch, what we call Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But in the Hebrew Bible they are known by the first words on the scroll. Genesis is called in the beginning. Exodus is called these are the names. Leviticus is and he called. Numbers is in the wilderness, and Deuteronomy is these are the words. The Hebrew Bible then lists what are regarded as prophetic books. There are 2 subgroups of prophets. The first is Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings. Both Samuel and Kings are just 1 volume in the Hebrew Old Testament. The major reason being that the Hebrew language uses consonants and not vowels, so they only took up half the space. When these books were translated into first Greek and then English, they took up more space, so were divided into 2 books, because the vowels doubled the length of the words. But these 4 books are classified not as history, but as prophecy, because they are prophetic insights into history. Samuel was the prophet who dominated that early period, and during the period of the kings there were dozens of prophets. It was the prophets who wrote the history and interpreted it, and showed the people what God was doing. The later prophets were placed into a second subgroup, which is much the same as in the English Bible. The Writings are a kind of miscellaneous box in which everything else goes. It includes the Psalms, the word literally means praises, Job and Proverbs. Ruth is not considered a prophetic book, so it goes into the Writings, which is not the case in the English Bible. The Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther and Daniel are also included. It is especially surprising that Daniel is not put among the prophets, but he speaks of other nations. As the chart shows, the last book in the Jewish Old Testament is Chronicles, only it is called the Words of the Days. So it is clear that the book is regarded in a totally different light to Kings. One book is prophetic and the other is not. This is a much better arrangement than the English one, not least because the last word in the English Old Testament at the end of Malachi is curse. In the Hebrew Bible, the last words are go up, as in let us go up to Jerusalem. In the English arrangement, we have 3 quite different groupings. We treat Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy as history and lump them in with Joshua and Judges as if it just carries on. We include Ruth because we think it is also part of the history. Then Samuel, Kings and Chronicles come in order. This is why we tend to get the impression that Chronicles is just saying the same thing over again. The result of this is that 1 and 2 Chronicles are very little known in church circles. There are only 2 verses that are widely quoted. The first is from 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. There was a musical called If My People, based on that one verse, and yet the verse was taken right out of context. It was used as if I will heal their land applied to England or America, but the land in question was of course the land of Israel, and there is nothing to allow us to apply it to any other land. The other well-known verse is from the reign of King Jehoshaphat, when he was attacked by 3 separate nations who became allies against Judah. They marched on Jehoshaphat, who in response prayed and sought the Lord. The prophets told him, "You are going to win the battle," but he was told to send singers ahead of the army. So the choir led the army into battle and sang praises to God, and the enemy fled. This only happened on one occasion and hardly provides a precedent for singing in the streets to drive out things of the city, as some Christians have thought. Both of these verses have been taken right out of context. But sadly, apart from these 2 verses, people don't know Chronicles at all. Duplication. The books of Chronicles and Kings are of course not the only parts of the Bible where the same period is covered twice. There are 2 accounts of creation in Genesis in chapters 1 and 2, one from God's point of view, one from man's point of view. There are 4 accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament. Even though the books seem the same, they each come from a different angle because each gospel was written for a different kind of person. The writing of Chronicles and Kings reminds us that all history has an angle. You cannot write history without betraying your personal interest, because from all that happens, you select the things that you are interested in and that you think are important. Having given that selection, you then connect them up to show how one thing led to another, and then you evaluate what you have written. So a historian goes through the steps of selection, connection, and evaluation, and moral judgments are being made about what should be included. Even in the spoof history book, 1066 and all that, moral judgments were being made all the way through about whether a thing was good or bad. In the same way, you find that the moral judgment in Kings is quite different from that in Chronicles. Comparing Samuel, Kings and Chronicles. Samuel and Kings were only 2 books in the Hebrew Old Testament. They are 4 books in ours, and they cover a period of 500 years only. But when we read Chronicles, we find that the book starts much earlier and finishes later. It mentions Adam returning through the centuries to the very beginning of the human race. Samuel and Kings finish in the exile, but in Chronicles we have the return 70 years later. Let us go up to Jerusalem is the last word in Chronicles. And therefore, these 2 writers had quite a different task in front of them, and they met that need quite differently. In Kings, the people needed an explanation for why they had been sent into exile, but in Chronicles they knew why. They just needed to be encouraged and sent back to the land to re-establish the walls of the city and rebuild the temple. Kings is written quite soon after the events, Chronicles long after. Political history dominates Kings, while Chronicles is mostly religious history. So Kings is written from a prophetic viewpoint and Chronicles from a priestly viewpoint. Kings covers the north and the south. Chronicles, covering the same period, never mentions a single northern king. The writer is not interested in the north at all. That's a huge difference. Kings concentrates on the human failings of the kings that led to disaster. But the chronicler wants to concentrate on divine faithfulness. So in Chronicles, the royal vices are played down in favour of the royal virtues, so that Chronicles has a more positive view of the kings. It is not that the chronicler is trying to change history. Rather, he selects mostly good things that the kings did. The emphasis is moral, and the key word is righteous. Kings answers the question of whether the kings were righteous or not. But in Chronicles, the interest is more in ritual, the temple and the sacrifices, with the emphasis on spiritual rather than moral issues. So in Kings we have a prophetic writing, and in Chronicles a priest. The difference of viewpoint is enormous. It has already become clear that one of the best ways of assessing the focus of Chronicles is to ask what material is omitted that is included in Kings and Samuel. A mere glance at the contents gives a clue. In Samuel, Saul has about 1/6 of the book, with the life of David accounting for 2/3. Solomon's life accounts for about half of 1 Kings, and the divided kingdom also has about half. So what is going on? What is the chronicler leaving out? Omissions. Number 1, there is no mention of Samuel's part in choosing kings. Number 2, Saul barely receives a mention. We have Saul's death, but it is only mentioned to introduce David. There's nothing about the rest of Saul's life. The writer wants the readers to see the kings in a good light, and so most of Saul's reign is ignored. Number 3, David is mentioned at some length, but even then it is interesting to note what is omitted. His struggles with Saul are ignored, and there's no mention of his 7-year reign in Hebron or his many wives. Absalom's rebellion is missed out, and the whole episode with Bathsheba, the turning point in David's reign, does not receive a single line. This selection of material is very significant. The chronicler is including positive stories and leaving out anything that is unsavoury. So with the absence of the episode with Bathsheba, David appears in a wonderful light, as does Solomon. There is not a word here about his many wives. the idols that were brought into the palace, his faulty relationship with God, or his failure to deal with the high places and the presence of pagan temples. This positive focus continues throughout the book. After the division of the kingdom, the chronicler omits the kings in the north in favour of the kings of the south. He gives a lot of space to the good kings, like the boy king Josiah and Hezekiah, but the bad kings receive hardly any coverage at all. Unless the chronicler is prejudiced, he is quite deliberate in his editing decisions. He has certain interests. There are common themes that were not prominent in Saul's reign, but were in David's and Solomon's, and in the reigns of some of the kings of Judah. Inclusions. First of all, the chronicler is only concerned with the royal line of David. None of the kings of the north were in the royal line, so they don't receive a mention. Chronicles is specifically a history of the royal house of David and nothing else. So Saul is not included because he was not in the royal line of David, but was from the tribe of Benjamin. One man is included at some length who receives little mention in Kings, namely Zerubbabel. He was of the royal line of David and came back from the Babylonian exile. It was in him that the people's hopes for the Messiah lay, because he was the only one to return from David's line. So when the chronicler gets to the genealogy, there is half a chapter on Zerubbabel's family tree. He is painting the royal line in a very favourable light. Religious focus. Chronicles is especially concerned with the king's attitude to the ark and the temple. He concentrates on any records about the people's treatment of the Ark of the Covenant and the temple in which it was housed as the place where God would live among his people. So we are told how David brought the Ark to Jerusalem, of his desire to build the temple, his preparation for it, the gathering of the materials, drawing the plans, and how he arranged the services of worship and the choirs and the choir masters. The great detail in Chronicles is almost skipped over in Kings and Samuel. Furthermore, 6 of the 9 chapters focusing on Solomon are almost exclusively concerned with his part in building the temple that his father David was not allowed to build. The chronicler records Solomon's prayer when it was dedicated and how the glory of the Lord came. It is Chronicles that contains the account of the underground quarry from which materials for the temple were brought. So this focus suggests a priest's view of history. A prophet would concentrate on the bad things the kings did, which brought judgment on the land. But the priest is pleased to record the building of the temple, the arrangement of choirs, and the establishment of worship. He knew David as the man who was the worship leader, the psalm writer, and the man who wanted the temple built. David and Solomon are thus seen in a different light from kings. After Solomon's time, when the kingdom was divided, the chronicler is only interested in the south, because that's where the temple and priests of God are, and where the royal line is kept. He picks out 8 kings, 5 of them good, and in accordance with his principle, ignores the 12 very bad kings in the south. We have already noted his focus on David and Solomon. Let us look briefly at the other 6 kings. 6 kings. Asa. He selects Asa, who puts away the idols in Judah and Benjamin, and removed his mother from the palace because she was secretly worshipping an idol in her bedroom. It was Asa who made a covenant with the Lord and enriched the temple with silver and gold so that in a priest's eyes he was a good man. Jehoshaphat. Then we have the account of Jehoshaphat, Asa's son, who sent the Levites to teach the law of God in every city. He was victorious over Ammon and Moab. We saw earlier that he sent the singers into battle at the head of the army, and he was instrumental in restoring a stronger focus upon God. Jehoram. One bad king who is mentioned is Jehoram, but his mention is crucial to the plot. His big mistake was in marrying Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, whose parents had been steeped in the worship of foreign gods. She came south and made a bid for the throne, killing most of the royal princes. But a priest named Jehoiada kidnapped the youngest prince, Joash, hid him for 6 years, and later produced him as the rightful king. Once again, a priest plays a crucial part in preserving the royal line of David. Joash. Joash was also mixed in character. He restored the temple by encouraging the people to give money towards its upkeep. But he slew the godly Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, in spite of the kindness that Jehoiada had shown to him. Hezekiah. Hezekiah reopened and repaired the temple. The people celebrated the Passover with great joy. His reforms are covered in just a few verses in Kings, but are given 3 chapters in Chronicles. He reformed the worship and re-established the temple in people's thinking. Josiah. The chronicler also spends much time on Josiah, the boy king, who during the spring cleaning of the temple found the book of the law. He returned proper services and feasts to the temple and attempted to reform the nation at a time of pagan worship. All these kings opposed idolatry, which is why they were good kings in the eyes of the priests. The interesting thing is that although idolatry was prevalent before the exile, when the Jews returned from exile, they were never tempted as a nation to return to idolatry, and they haven't to this very day. Crucial to our understanding of Chronicles is to note that it ends with Cyrus the Persian overcoming the Babylonians and sending the Jews back to their land to rebuild the temple. So the readership comprises those who are returning from exile. They have never seen a Jewish temple and aren't ruled over by a king in David's line. The chronicler tells them 3 things. I call them the 3 R's. He wants to give them roots, royalty, and religion again. So Chronicles has a clear purpose. He is preaching, not just teaching history. Returning exiles. Who they were. A rooted people. What they were. A royal people. Why they were a religious people. Identity. The returning exiles needed to know who they were. They had roots that stretched back to Adam, for God himself had been controlling their history. They belonged to God, and he had singled them out from the whole human race, selected Abraham and preserved them as a people. Thus, they were not merely inhabitants of a land, but a people whose identity was tied up in God's purposes, hence the lengthy genealogies. Leadership. The second thing they needed to know was that they were a royal people with their own king. The chronicler wanted them to start thinking about the king again and to restore the kingdom of Israel. He was telling them, you're not just a group of people, You're a royal priesthood, a royal people. You have a king, and the royal line has been preserved, and you're going to be a kingdom again. So as the people faced the temptation to sink into a slave mentality, the book was to be a great inspiration. Purpose. The third thing he wanted to convey was the purpose for which they existed as a people. The most important thing that made them what they were was the fact that they were God's chosen people. Their worship of God was absolutely central to their identity as a people, so when they returned, their priority was to get the temple rebuilt and for worship to be re-established after the pattern of Moses. We have noted already that over 10% of those who returned were priests, which is a far higher proportion than the number of priests in the whole people. They were committed to re-establishing Israel as a religious nation, so rebuilding the temple was a top priority. The name Jew literally means praise God. They were keen to live up to their name. So Chronicles was a sermon for a returning remnant to encourage them to persevere amidst the difficult times. It wasn't a very exciting business, and they had to struggle to make a living. They were very poor, and building the temple was slow work. It needed 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to urge them to keep going. But the chronicler had to get the truth installed in them that God must come first in their life as a people. Israel exists today largely because its people wanted a home of their own where they could be safe, though I am sad to say that they did not really go back to establish themselves as God's people. I'll never forget the 45 minutes I spent with a president of Israel in his residence. At the end of the talk he said, "Well, I'm an agnostic. I don't really believe in God." I replied, "But this is the land where God did his greatest miracles." He said, "Well, I can't believe it." I was very sad. It was so important that they went back as God's people, and that the temple should be the very centre of their return and their hopes. They have returned to their land, but not to their Lord. Christian application. Christ. The themes of Chronicles were picked up in the life of Christ. Roots. Matthew begins with a genealogy of Christ, and Luke takes the genealogy right back to Adam. It was important that the reader was convinced about the veracity of Christ's roots. Christ was and is a Jew, not a rootless person dropped arbitrarily into history, but sent to fulfill the expectations of a particular people. Royalty. Furthermore, Christ was born in the royal line, so he could claim to be the son of David. Indeed, he could inherit the throne twice over. Through his father, he had a legal right to the throne, and through his mother, a physical right, because they could both trace their family tree back to David. And though he is not yet openly a king, he is the one who is on David's throne forever. Religion. He was also the fulfillment of Israel's religious hopes, because he actually became the temple. We are told in the early part of John's Gospel that the Word was made flesh and tabernacled among us. Referring to his body, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." He saw himself as the focus of their worship, as one who fulfilled the symbol of the temple. He would make many of the Jewish practices obsolete, for many of them had been brought in to serve as pointers to him. Christians, roots. The Apostle Paul explains that Christians have been grafted into God's people, so that even as Gentiles we can say that we have Jewish roots. Their genealogy is ours, so when I read 1 Chronicles 1-9, I am reading my family tree, because I am now a son of Abraham. Such roots are even more significant to us than our own family tree. Our family tree will disappear at death, but it's the Jewish family tree that is now our genealogy. In Christ we inherit the blessings of Abraham. Royalty. Peter reminds us in his first letter that we are now royal people and a royal priesthood. We are princes and princesses who should walk down the street like royalty, for we are going to reign over this world with Christ. Revelation tells us that God has redeemed people from every kindred and tribe to reign on the earth. Therefore, like the ancient Jews, we can live with dignity, knowing who we are and what our position is. Religion. In addition, we have become the temple. Paul asks, don't you know that your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit? We are to reflect this in the way we live. The 3 things that the people returning from the exile needed to be taught, we need to claim too. The one big difference for us is that we are still in exile. We haven't come home yet. We're strangers and pilgrims in a foreign land. I live in England, but I don't belong here. Our citizenship is in heaven, and that can cause tension with those with whom we mix. After all, Jesus said to his disciples, they hated me, so they're likely to hate you also. Consequently, we have to work hard to keep our relationships with unbelieving relatives and friends, because now we belong to a new family. We must remember that what we do to our body, we're doing with the temple of God. This is one reason why so many people give up smoking when they become Christians. There's nothing in the Bible against smoking. As I often say, it won't take you to hell, it only makes you smell as if you've already been there. But many Christians come to realize that by smoking they are abusing the temple of God, making it smell, making it dirty, and shortening its life. So Chronicles is not just a dull old bit of history duplicating what has already been said. It is a message of hope for the future, showing us what we're here for and how to find our true identity as a people of God in a strange land. It is a vital book with a vital message, both for the people at the time and for us today.